This is Fatih Kırşanlı. I teach at the Department of Economics at the Social Sciences University of Ankara. And today we are having our third EconTalks. That is going to be our departmental usual habit that we are trying to implement in the department. And we are hosting and guest Chandan K is going to be our guest speaker today. He's a close friend and colleague of mine. He teaches at the Madden College of Business and Economics in Moyne College, located in New York, as an associate professor. Chandan got his PhD from Louisiana State University in 2015. His research examines issues in economic development with an emphasis on corruption, gender, and finance. His work underscores the importance of culture and institutions for socioeconomic outcomes. He is a very well-published, prominent scholar who has almost over 1,000 citations according to Google Scholar. His work has been published in Public Choice, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Economic Modeling with me, European Journal of Political Economy, International Journal of Finance and Economics, again with me, among the many. So he is an associate editor of studies in Microeconomics Journal, and he is also in the editorial board of SN Business and Economics Journal. Lastly, he is a co-editor of the book titled The Political Economy of Corruption, which is the title of today's talk as well, published back in 2023 by one of the prominent publishers, Routledge. So Chandan, the floor is yours. You are going to have around like 40 to 45 minutes, and then we can ask our questions at the end, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share my slides here. So please confirm that you can see my slides.
We can definitely see. If you can make it perhaps the full screen, that will be
Yeah, I'm going to do that here, and I'm going to switch presenter view and slide view.
excellent.
Okay. All right, perfect. So thank you so much, Fatih, for inviting me for the talk, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It's a pleasure to present, this talk here. So as you can see, the title is The Political Economy of Corruption. Which, as Fatih just mentioned, this is also the title of the book that I'm one of, I'm one of the editors of, which came out in 2023. So the idea for the talk is that what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the corruption, right? And then talk about that why we actually got this book. So I'm going to tie, this whole thing with the book as well. And then I'm going to discuss a few papers, one of ours, and then some papers by others people, and then that would be the presentation for today. So rather than focusing on any work of mine, I'm going to sort of have a broad talk. So let's first start with the fact that why do we really care about corruption, right? And by now there is a really large literature on the different adverse effects of corruption. There is studies that have shown that it impacts economic growth, it impacts poverty and income inequality. Actually, corruption also is responsible for taking many lives in different ways. So one of the ways could be, for example, corruption impacts infrastructural facilities, right? Or how houses are built, for example, right? And then studies have shown that areas with more corruption experience more deaths due to something like even earthquakes, right, or floods, because the buildings are not up to the codes and things like that. And then corruption indeed impacts many people in day-to-day life. So there could be, depending on the country you live in, right, there is corruption which impacts you directly in a day-to-day life, or it could be indirectly. So for example, coming from India, which figures quite low in absence of corruption, right? Score, where, in other words, corruption is quite high. I have observed people are being subject to corruption, right, on a daily basis. Okay. So for example, you might have actually this paper in Bertrand et al. This is a QJE paper that shows that, well, when you go to get a driver's license, right, you can experience corruption there as well. Well, there is your another reason how corruption kills. Okay. But again, I do want to mention this at the outset that there is actually two views of corruption. Some of them talk about, for example, the sand the wheel versus grease the wheel views of corruption, where the argument goes that sometimes corruption can actually speed the economic growth by speeding up the process of getting, let's say, permits and things like that, and which might otherwise be stuck in the bureaucratic process, right? But I want to emphasize here that those lines are actually talking about that is a second best situation. Okay. So in fact, if you really think about it, the reason bureaucrats are actually delaying the process is because they think that they can extract, corruption, or bribery or bribes. If they could not do that, then they would probably not delay the process to begin with. Anyways, the point is that at this point, the evidence is very clear that corruption is generally bad for different part of socio-economic lives. Okay. Now, corruption is also impacting. It is very important for us to have very strong institutions so that we can promote the peaceful and inclusive societies. The Sustainable Development Goals actually clearly, uh, recognizes the value of strong institutions, which also means, low corruption. Now, another thing is that unfortunately, corruption is found everywhere in the world, right? In every region, almost 1 in 6 businesses, for example, according to this SDG report 2022, 1 in 6 businesses have received bribe requests from public officials. And by all counts, this is actually probably an underestimate, because many businesses might simply not even acknowledge that they received the bribe request for the fear of retaliation, even when the surveys are anonymous. Okay. So that's quite big of a number. If we really look at, in terms of country, so thankfully there are some corruption indexes, and I'm going to talk about them. So if you look at the corruption, so these are control of corruption indexes from the World Bank, control of perception index, corruption perception index. The rightmost row is from Transparency International, and I'll talk about them a little bit. There are countries which are quite corrupt. There are very few countries which score pretty good. Most of them are European countries like New Zealand, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. But even those countries, actually, as you can see, they have quite high level of, even they are not perfect. In other words, even there is corruption. And some more African countries are very, very high corrupt, as we can see from here, scoring like 10 out of 100, for example, in CPI rank. If you want to see how does Turkey figure out, I just wanted to, you to see that. Turkey is not doing pretty good either. It is somewhere, I mean, in the developing country, right? So developing country has the problem. So Turkey figures in, somewhere in the middle with something like Sri Lanka or Peru, El Salvador, so something like that. As I said, no country is basically corruption free. Even the cleanest countries have, certain amount of corruption. Okay. Now, uh, generally generally we use the definition of corruption as the abuse of entrusted power, which is our public office for private gain. Okay. So bureaucrats or politicians, right? So generally the political corruption and bureaucratic corruption are the two biggest levels of corruption. So what is happening is that the bureaucrats are provided some kind of authority, right, to run their departments, right? And so what they might want to do is that, or what they might do is that they might use that office or that authority that they have for private gains. Okay. Uh, so many a times what happens is that the bureaucrats might not necessarily they might not necessarily deny you the service, but they can delay the service to the extent that its utility is lost. Okay. And so that gives an opportunity for them to extract bribes. And another problem that happens in the corruption research is that there is not an universally accepted norm of what corruption is, So something that is corruption in one country might not be corruption in other country. So for example, in many developed countries, including the United States, lobbying is accepted as, it is an accepted part of life, right? Lobbying is legal. But in some other countries like India, for example, lobbying would be considered corruption. Okay. So corruption research is not always an easy thing to do. Uh, and then there are other types of corruption which are very, very hard to identify. So for example, again, nepotism, finding out or, identifying nepotism and proving that is very, very difficult. And sometimes there might simply be quid pro quo, okay, which is again very difficult to identify. And then there are also different kind of corruption, grand corruption versus petty corruption. So grand corruption is something that you might not see in a daily to daily life, but it impacts you. So for example, imagine there is a corruption in a road project, okay, road building project. So this is a grand corruption that will typically happen between the business people, right, and bureaucrat and politicians, and it does not directly impact you, or at least you don't see it. It doesn't immediately impact you, but of course, the roads are bad, the bridges might collapse, and you might lose your life. So it does impact you in that sense. Petty corruption is where you are generally impacted directly. So you might have to go to hospital and you might have to pay a bribe to simply get a hospital bed, for example. So that would be kind of petty corruption. So one of the reasons it is very, very hard to measure is corruption by definition is an illegal activity. Okay. So nobody who took a bribe is ever going to say that, yeah, I accepted a bribe. What about people who paid a bribe? In many countries, actually paying bribe is illegal as well. Okay. And so if paying a bribe is illegal, then even if somebody is a bribe payer, they do not want to accept that they paid a bribe. Okay. So what happens sometimes is it becomes important to distinguish between something called harassment bribery and collusive bribery. So harassment bribery or extortionary bribery is where the bribe taker or the bureaucrat has an authority over the bribe giver, and the bribe giver is not getting anything undue advantage. So imagine you know how to drive a car, okay, and you go to the DMV office to get the driving license. So you know how to drive the car. So it is your right to get the car, driving license after you pay whatever the official fees is and you take the test. But the driving official, the DMV official insists that you have to pay the bribe. If you don't pay the bribe, then they can simply delay the delivery of a license to you. Or imagine you are going to get a passport and they force you, even though you deserve, it is your right to get the passport by providing the necessary documents. The passport officials might insist that they are not going to process your application, or they are going to delay it so much that you are going to lose your, let's say, your itinerary, right, or your purpose of travel. So you might have to pay a bribe. So in this case, you are paying a bribe even though you are not taking any undue advantage. On the other hand, there could be something called collusive bribery. In the collusive bribery, the bribe giver and bribe taker, they collude and both of them get undue advantage. So that could be, for example, let's say you're trying to get a government contract. Okay. Even though you are not the best person for the job, you pay a bribe and you get that contract. Okay. So in this case, both are paying bribes to get some undue advantage. And so in the collusive bribery, obviously, if you are a bribe giver, you don't want to accept that because you are on the wrong as well. But in the harassment bribery, or also called extortionary bribery, even though you are not wrong, you still do not want to accept that you paid a bribe because of something called asymmetric versus symmetric liabilities. In most countries, there is symmetric liability. So in other words, paying a bribe is illegal too, even if it is an extortionary bribe. Okay. However, in some countries, it is asymmetric bribe. So asymmetric bribe is where you are going to be punished only if you took the bribe. The bribe payer is not punished. Okay. So in countries where there will be asymmetric liability, it might be slightly easier to measure corruption than in asymmetric liability. And finally, as I said, the main thing is that the value of the product or service, it is a function of the time it takes for me to get the service. So if I receive my passport too late, then it is useless to me because the purpose of my travel is gone. And that gives the bureaucrats an opportunity to extract bribes. So all these things make it very hard to measure. And uh, major corruption because of that. Well, and then many a times, as you know, right, you start bribery by offering something of value, right? And then it's a thin line whether it's corruption or not. Okay. So before I get into detail, let me some of you who are not doing corruption research, nevertheless, there are certain common data sources for corruption, even though it is hard to measure. Most of them are actually perception-based measures of corruption, which exist at the country level. So control of corruption index is by the World Bank, corruption perception index is by Transparency International, which is a very well-known NGO. And then there is International Risk Corruption Index, which is a corporation which collects this data. So as I said, all these are actually a perception-based data, meaning these are not actual instances of corruption, but rather people, businessmen, people, and NGOs are surveyed and they are asked what kind of corruption exists in the country. Okay. Then there is survey data that is used as well, which is one is World Values Survey, which is again not actual corruption data, but it is about people's perception whether corruption is good or bad. Then World Bank Enterprise Survey interviews businesses. They will tell you whether they were asked for corruption or not, or rather firms like them were asked for corruption. And then there is International Crime Victimization Survey. They have some data on corruption where they have actual data on corruption in the sense that people are asked whether they were asked for bribery, and then they will tell that whether or not they were asked for bribery or not. Okay. So there are these different measures of corruption that are still available, and people are using those to people are able to use those to do for corruption research. Okay. As I said, they do have their own problems. Nevertheless, they exist. Now let's go back to the main idea that I wanted to talk about here, and then why did this book, was necessary. So if you really go to the Beckerian crime enforcement model, right, then the idea is that bureaucrats or politicians or whoever be in this situation, they engage into corruption is because they're expecting some kind of utility. Okay. So that utility from the corruption is obviously going to be subject to two things. One is that you obviously, since corruption is an illegal activity, there is obviously some probability that you will be caught. Okay. So if you are caught, then whatever payoff you receive, which most of the studies have actually thought about only monetary benefits, but it's not just monetary benefit. There could also be some kind of psychological benefits or psychological cost. Okay. So that has to be accounted for. So if you are caught, then whatever bribe you received minus whatever the fine you paid, right? But if you are not caught, then the probability is actually quite high for that, then whatever your probability is. So in other words, the idea in this model is that a bureaucrat or a politician is simply going to compare the cost benefit analysis. To the extent that expected benefits outweigh expected cost, they would do the corrupt activities. But if that doesn't happen, if the benefits are higher than the cost, if the costs are higher than the benefits, then they will not. They will not. But the question is, one of the things that happens is that the benefits typically occur right away. So you take the bribe, you get the money, it is certain, and it's done. But the cost is two things. It is one, it is uncertain. And the second, it is going to happen sometime in the future. So people discount the costs. Okay. So in many countries, proving that corruption has taken place is very, very difficult. Very few people are ever charged or punished for corruption, or the probability of getting caught is very small. And that is why what happens is that, typically the expected benefits are higher. Then more importantly, in last several decades, almost all countries have done some kind of anti-corruption initiative. They have brought anti-corruption policies which are trying to increase the cost of the punishment. Okay. Nevertheless, corruption persists everywhere in the world. So that indicates that there is more than just incentives. There is more than just monetary benefits that determines what corruption could be. Okay. And that is where this book comes in. This book comes in where we look at some of the new things that go beyond the standard Beckerian, enforcement model. That it's not just the monetary benefits or the monetary cost, but there are other factors that are at play, and we could take example benefit of that. So, for example, there is this quite famous paper in Journal of Political Economy, I believe, that culture matters. Okay, so whether when we look at the corruption, the culture matters. Okay, so what do we mean by that? So what happened is that they look at a natural experiment that happened in New York City. So prior to November 2002, okay, if you were a diplomat and your family was, so a diplomat and their families, if they did some kind of parking violation, they would not have to pay fines. Okay, so they had legal immunity. Okay, however, the situation has become bad, and then starting November 2002, the New York City, right, they started doing is that if you had more than 3 unpaid parking violations, they started to strip off the plates. Okay, so now they were enforcing. So the law was there before as well, but there's legal immunity, diplomat immunity, and they were not enforcing it. But in November 2002, they started enforcing the unpaid parking violations. Okay, so what is happening here? Before this happened, right, or even after that, right, diplomats are always treated the same way. Okay, so in other words, the legal, right, the legal environment is same for diplomats from every country. Okay, no matter where you come from. Okay, so therefore, what should have happened is that we should have seen high rates of parking violations by diplomats from all countries, right? Because everybody was subject to the same regulation or whatever. However, if you see in this graph, what they found is that the diplomats who came from more corrupt countries, they had higher parking violations compared to diplomats who came from less corrupt countries. So that is showing the effect of culture. Okay. So what is the culture? So the diplomats who came from more corrupt country, they are used to of being, corrupt or showing their authority and power, right? So when they come to the US, even though now they're in a different country where institutions are stronger, right? They behave in the same way. So they will park illegally because they are not subject to the parking violations, right? They don't have to pay tickets. But if people came from, let's say, something like Germany or Sweden, which are less corrupt countries, even though they also did not have to pay fines for parking violations, they would still not park illegally. They will park legally. Okay. Once that law was implemented, they found that there's a strong decline in the parking violations by all the diplomats. So the idea is that it's not just the money, it's not just the monetary incentive that matters, but your culture also matters. Okay. Similarly, norms matter. So for example, just consider this situation. Let's say you came home from the airport. Okay. It's a 4 a.m. morning flight or whatever. You come home, you take a taxi, and then the taxi driver drops you at home. And then you are like, you know what? I'm not paying you. Okay, I'm not paying you. So you don't say that I'm not paying you. You tell them, even though you don't pay them, you tell them that, okay, I have paid you. Right? It's your neighborhood. The taxi driver will say that, okay, he's lying. Of course, there is nobody to prove it, right? There is nobody to prove. Okay. So if people start shouting, your neighbors will come. Obviously, naturally, they are going to take your side. So why do you pay them? Why don't you just lie that I have paid you? Well, because, there is something more than just the money, right? So norms matter. So that's the idea. Okay. So if you are doing corruption research in empirical corruption research, one of the problems has been you see very few panel analysis because there is this omitted variable bias, which, as you know, countries are different in different characteristics. Some of those are observed, some of those are unobserved. And then there is sometimes the reverse causality issue as well, right? And so that makes it very difficult. So I'm going to talk about the situation using one of the papers that we did. So you know that one of the possibilities when you cannot do the panel, or even when you can do the panel, is to use the instrumental variable analysis, right? Which essentially means that you find an instrument, right? A variable G that is highly correlated with the endogenous variable of interest. Okay, so if I'm looking at the effect of X1 on, let's say, Y, then we want this instrument Z to be highly correlated with the X1, right? But we do not want it to have any impact on Y directly. Whatever the effect comes, it must happen through X1, right? Which is called validity or exclusion restriction. Now, as you know, it is also very difficult to find instruments, okay? So one of the things that we wanted to do is I wanted to discuss this paper. This is a GBO paper that we published in 2018, where we wanted to look at the effect of women's representation in different positions on corruption. So this also somehow relates to the cultural thing here, or some other factors at play, because women have the same monetary incentive to be corrupt as men, right? Presuming that they are in the similar positions. But there are previous studies that also showed that women's representation in economic and political arena was negatively associated with corruption. So we wanted to revisit this association in sort of a causal way. So of course, there could be omitted variable. So countries with certain characteristics, for example, some people argued that liberal democracies have more women, right, in parliament or in labor force, but they also tend to have less corruption. And then there could be reverse causality, right? So maybe corrupt governments are discouraging women's participation in politics and labor force, especially if they think women are less corrupt, right? Then they don't want those kind of women in the policy making positions. So what we did is that we used an instrument, and I'm going to talk about that, what our instruments are. So this is simple OLS estimates. When we do the OLS estimates, we find that women's share in the labor force is associated with lower corruption. But we also find that women's share in parliament is associated with lower corruption in the last two columns. But we do not find the women's share in clerical positions and decision-making positions to be associated with corruption. Okay, so I'll talk about why that might be the case. But before that, we wanted to do some instrument. Okay, so we used these two instruments. Number one was that when women were granted voting rights. So what we argued is that in countries where women were granted voting rights earlier, in those countries, there will be more women in the parliament. Okay, because they will become politically more, they have more time to become politically stronger. Okay. For exclusion restriction, we show that most countries actually women got voting rights, not because voting rights were asked for women, but voting rights were asked for different kind of weaker sections of the society. So in some societies it could have been poor. In some societies, for example, the United States, it could be African Americans, right? So when voting rights were given to these weaker sections of the society, women got it at the same time. So it was quite exogenous. And the second was years since transition to agriculture. So there is this famous paper by Hansen, Jensen, and Skopsgaard in 2015, Journal of Economic Growth, where they show that societies that moved to agriculture earlier, in those societies, gender inequality is higher. So in other words, if gender inequality is higher, there will be fewer women in parliament. Okay. We also see that, by the way, in a simple linear fit, you can see that the countries where women were granted voting rights later, right, percentage of women in parliament indeed is less. Okay, so we use that as an instrument, and then I want you to just look at the first, the top one. We find that the share of women in parliament is negatively associated with corruption. We do bunch of things here, controlling for a bunch of variables, and then we do some weak instrument robust specification, and the results remain robust. Okay, then for women's share in the labor force, we also did some interesting instrument here that is again driven by some existing papers that show that countries where there are two genders in the language, masculine versus feminine, versus there are one or three. Okay, so where there is one, it is just neutral. Okay. And if this is 3, then feminine, masculine, and neuter gender. So they are arguing that the societies which have only 2 genders in their language, masculine versus feminine, in those countries subconsciously, okay, subconsciously, you are making always, difference, between men and women. So gender inequality is higher. When we do that, we indeed find that that is true. So countries where there is only 2 genders in the language, in those countries, there are fewer women in the labor force, as you can see in the first stage regression. And then we find that once we use that as an instrument, we find no impact of share of women in the labor force. So our argument is that women's representation only in parliament matters, because when women are in parliament, then they have the ability to make laws, right? Policy making positions. And that is where women's representations in the parliament matters. Okay. So again, that can also be linked to culture in certain extent. Okay. So there are many studies that show that, for example, women tend to be less so women tend to be more pro charity. So for example, when they did the charity games, they found that women were more cooperative. They contributed more, right? And then there are also the fact that women tend to choose policies differently than men do. So there's a lot of evidence from different parts of the world that if women are in the parliament or in the government or policy making positions, they will choose policies that are better for family and the welfare of the children and women. On the other hand, men tend to choose different kind of policies. Okay. So we are attributing our results to that. So that was the cultural part. Let's move to the institutional part a little bit. Okay. So we are going to talk about, I'm going to talk about this paper in the Journal of Public Economics, which is by Klaus Abink et al., where they were going to look at, they did some kind of experimental, investigation. So as I was discussing earlier, right, whether the bribe payer is being punished or not, right, if that person is held liable for, for crime as well, will determine whether the person is willing to, report the bribery to the authorities, right? And so the idea is, this was actually proposed by the Kaushik Basu, who is one of the researchers. He was at the World Bank, head of the World Bank, and he was a chief economic advisor to the government of India. At that time, he actually proposed. So India has symmetric liability policy. So in India, if you pay the bribe, then you are also subject to legal sanctions. Okay. So even if I was forced to pay a bribe for something that I have the right to, right, I would still be subject to um, legal sanctions. So Kaushik Basu suggested that India should move to symmetric, liability for specific cases of bribe, again, which is the harassment bribe. So in the cases of bribe where the bribe payer is forced to pay the bribe rather than he's willingly paying the bribe, right? In that case, we should move to asymmetric liability policy. So what is happening in symmetric, both bribe giver and taker are fined. Obviously, they have to be caught, right? In the asymmetric liability, only the bribe taker will be fined. If I'm a bribe payer, right, then I will not be fined and my bribe will be returned. Okay. Then there is a third possibility where the retaliation. If it is a multiple game, right, then if, let's say, I paid the bribe and I reported it to the authorities, right, then the other public officials might also retaliate. Okay. And then the last is interval. The last treatment was that there's retaliation, but the bribe is not refunded. Okay. So this is the game. So in the game, there is an official which has an opportunity to either demand a bribe, okay, or no demand or that cannot if they also have the opportunity to not demand a bribe. So if the bribe is not demanded, then the official and the citizen, right, both have a payoff of 500 rupees. So this was Indian currency, right, 500 rupees. They did this experiment in a college. So both got 500 rupees, okay, which at that time was equivalent to more like $10, by the way, just to give you an idea. Okay. Now official has an opportunity that they can ask a bribe that will range from 10 rupees to 200 rupees. If they did that, then the citizen has a choice whether the citizen refuses to pay a bribe. If they refuse to pay the bribe, then their payoff decreases from 500 to 50. Okay. And then we also see that officials payoff also decreases. That is happening simply because bribery, right, is reducing the economic activities, right? So in a sense, you can think of it that the country is less developed because of those lost economic opportunities. So the official's salary is now low. Okay. Yeah. Now the if or the citizen has the choice that they can pay but they will not report. If they pay quietly, if they don't report, then the likelihood of getting caught is only 5%. If they pay uh, and not getting caught is 95%. If the official gets caught, okay, then if it's a symmetric liability, then both of them have to be fined. So instead of 500, their payoff reduces to 200 each. Okay. However, if it's an asymmetric liability, then the bribe payer has 450 because that bribe payer is not subject to legal sanctions. Okay. And if they are not caught, then the official gets 450 plus whatever bribe they get. Yeah. And the citizen, 450 is their payoff, and then whatever bribe they pay, they just lose that much money. If the citizen decides to pay and report, if they do that, then of course the likelihood of getting caught increases, correct? Yeah, because now there is higher chance of getting caught. So again, the payoff remains the similar, only is that the probability that that the bribery will be discovered, that rises. Okay. Then this game, we change they change the payoff slightly, right? And now only thing, the payoffs will change, but the game is different in the sense that official has the opportunity to retaliate. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm just coming to the last node here. So if the official retaliates, right, then 400 plus bribe, right? So instead of 450, if they acquires, then that's 450. So why it's 450 to 400? Because what we are saying is that retaliation is costly. You cannot retaliate. Okay, so if you are retaliating against the people who have reported, then it is costly. Okay. Of course, when you're retaliating, then the citizens payoff also decreases. So citizen is losing more than, obviously, you do not want to retaliate if you are losing more money than the citizen, right? So that's why citizen is potentially not getting the service or getting the service at a very delayed time. So citizen is losing more money. Okay. So what was the result of their experiment? What they did find is that in the symmetric, roughly 18% people were paying up, refusing to pay, right? And then roughly 50% people were paying quietly. Okay. And then the rest were paying and reporting. All right. Because again, even if it is symmetric, even if I will be subject to fines, right, I'm still reporting. Some people are still reporting because, as I said, it's not only about money, because people are inherently also thinking about something wrong happened to them, right? And so they are willing to report even if it comes to them with a cost. When it becomes asymmetric liability, meaning if I had to pay a bribe, so if I report, okay, I am not subject to legal sanctions. In that situation, much bigger number of people are actually paying, but they are also reporting. So 60% people decide to report, right? So what is happening? The number of people who are not paying is still more or less the same, right? That is not changing. But the people who are paying and reporting, that becomes much larger, right? Of course, when there is a retaliation, some people now don't want to report, right? Because they are afraid of retaliation. So that goes down a little bit. And then when you look at no refund and retaliation, so people do care about monetary benefits. So if they don't get a refund, then the people who are reporting, that becomes slightly smaller. Okay. So in other words, this tells us that, again, in the spirit of the book, that it's not just the monetary incentive that matters, but there are other factors at play. Okay. So to sort of wrap up, because I'm also getting, near the time. So this is the book, where we had the first one is about cronyism and corruption. Then we talk about, on next chapter talks about institutional trust, the effect of legal system, right? We talked about legal system matters is another chapter. Then the paper by the chapter by Ajit Mishra shows that there's an optimal level of enforcement, right? Because enforcing is costly, right? And so where is that optimal enforcement? There is a paper on corruption and growth. Then how does it impact the financial sector? Then there are two chapters that are talking about experiments in this. Next chapter is about gender and corruption by Justin Isare and Natalie Valdez. As you can see, I'm not an author on that chapter. Then there is effect on culture. Technology matters. So our chapter is about technology. And then the chapter 13 is, I actually find quite interesting. Many the times when we think about corruption, we only think about developing countries, right? So this chapter is actually showing that corruption is actually quite bad in European countries, which are very, very developed countries. And then finally, the last chapter I have with the Nilesh Shah, who is working with the CAG, which is the Comptroller of Accounting General. So this is about practical perspective. So as an academician, we think that, okay, this is how we can solve the corruption. But when you are in the practical situation, you find it is a lot more difficult. So with that, I will stop. Thank you so much. And I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chandan. It has been a great presentation about the book, The Political Economy of Corruption. So if anyone has any question, perhaps they can raise their hand and then we can give the floor to them. Professor Said is raising his hand. Go ahead, Professor Said.
Yeah, this is just a short question. The last chart that was shared. So certain proportions are very close to each other and certain proportions are different as well. Did you carry out any statistical tests to see if they are significantly different?
Oh, yes. So okay. So this is not our paper, by the way. This paper is by some other co-authors. But yes, yeah, they are statistically different. So the main idea, their main, I'm not sure that the last two parts exactly, the reporting part was statistically significant or not. But the main idea of the paper is that once you make it asymmetric liability, that is the idea, right? So the idea is that right now in India, what happens is that if you paid a bribe, right, you would be subject to legal sanctions, right? So imagine I want passport, right? Getting a passport is my right as an Indian citizen, right? As long as I have not done anything wrong, correct?
Yes.
But suppose that I want to a passport and then I go to police and police says, well, I'm not gonna do the police verification until you pay me a bribe. Okay. So they are forcing me to pay the bribe. Yeah. And so I paid them the bribe because if I don't do that, I will not get a license and then I will not be able to come to the US. Okay. Which may not be very far from reality, by the way, back then. Okay. So when I do that, but now if I go and if I report that the police asked me for a bribe, then if it is proved in the court, then I will also be legally sanctioned. Okay. So the idea is that should we make it such that people who are forced to pay the bribe, they should not be subject to legal sanctions. So their main hypothesis was that, and they did find that indeed, if I share my screen one more time, let me share my screen one more time. So their main treatment was these two, the first and two, the symmetric and asymmetric. As you can see, this is quite statistically significant, which we can imagine. So this is their main symmetric versus asymmetric, and these were like some other treatments that they wanted to see. I'm not entirely sure whether retaliation and refund really mattered for them. I don't know. It's possible that that was not statistically significant. So you are right on point.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Then the other point, can I ask one more question?
Absolutely, please go ahead. Yeah.
So I consider bribes, I mean, two cases of bribes. One is that as per rule, I'm supposed to get certain thing, but somebody is delaying the process. So, and we understand that we need to pay. We may need to pay something. Like in Pakistan, if you're applying for passport outside, you will also see agents. Okay, you will see agents. So if you talk to the agent, and he will say, okay, this is the fees that I'm going to take, and he speeds up the process.
Yes.
Within that fee, there is a portion that goes to the guys in the office. So
Absolutely.
there is certain, and everybody understands this. So one thing is that, okay, I understand that if I pay the bribe, I get what I'm supposed to get. The other case, I don't know, I miss some part in between, is that when I'm not supposed to get something, but I give bribe and I get it, right? So there are
Yes.
two types of bribes. So is there such a distinction between in this analysis?
Yes, so indeed, so you are right. I did talk about that. I did talk about harassment bribery and collusive bribery.
Okay, all
So
right.
yeah. So I did talk about that. So when Kaushik Basu did suggest that, he was specifically talking about extortionary bribe or harassment bribe, where I as a bribe payer don't get anything, But imagine that I am a business person and I'm paying bribe to get undue advantage, or the contract that I don't deserve. He was clear that he was not suggesting asymmetric liability for those kind of corruption.
Just finally, sorry, one.
Sure. No, please go ahead. Yeah.
So you have this cross-country indexes of corruption, like we see Sweden, Norway as right at the top. Is there a study that examines the stages, moving from the bottom to the higher, better state? What are the things that matter? So if a country is a dynamic country, how do we know that it is making a headway? So can you put certain landmarks that if this happens, this happens, then country is moving in the right direction in eradicating corruption? Is there such an analysis? Is there something we can? So there are good examples, in between examples, and very bad examples, right? So the countries, there are countries which move from bad to a better case. So
Right.
what were the key factors that we could identify?
So so as you can probably imagine, since you don't know about any papers like that, because those papers like that don't exist, right? Because there are rarely any countries that have really had a jump in corruption, right? So they very slowly move to the right direction,
So
if they do,
what is
right?
what is that track? If somebody can identify certain stages, for example,
Right.
the local government system is very strong and the vote counts. So the mayor
Right.
performs. Okay, the mayor performs. So accountability comes to the people through the vote.
Exactly. So
One example.
yeah, so I think there will be a couple of things that I believe, based on my reading, couple of things. One is that the economic growth itself matters, right? So there is this feedback loop. Corruption hurts economic growth, but if the economic growth happens, then you have more resources, right? More resources to one, prevent corruption, and two, as people's bureaucrats' income rises, they also have more to lose in case they get caught. So one is sustained economic development will reduce corruption. Again, sustained economic development. Okay. The second, which I believe, is technology. I am a big believer in technology. I believe that technology, if anything, in the next few years, technology will be the biggest threat to corruption. The reason being that corruption is illegal everywhere, right? So the main reason corruption is able to take place is because it is very difficult to discover. Now imagine nowadays, since you are from Pakistan, I am from India, we have probably similar level of development and developed level of institutional structure, right? Because of our history, we have very similar institutional structure, right? So what happens is that, imagine in India, right, for example, there are certain states, and then I can compare different states that moved to e-government, electronic government earlier. So now in certain states, if you want to get certain things done, you don't have to go to the bureaucrat, right? You can do online application, and they are provided with certain time frame they have to provide with the service.
Yeah,
So
same.
they simply cannot ask you for a bribe through an email or electronic system, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But if I had to go to the office, then they're like, okay, give me some, I don't know, in India or Pakistan, we call it, chai wai pilaiye, right? So so you give them that money. So they ask for, like, okay, why don't you give us some money for tea and coffee, right? That's how they ask, right? So technology will be a big factor. If there are no direct interaction between people who are availing the service and the bureaucrat, then there is no opportunity for them to ask for corruption. Okay. So many things, when they become automated, they will reduce corruption. That's two. The third thing is, which I like is something that external control on corruption. Okay. So something like, for example, press, if you have media freedom, right? Because what happens is that when you talk about strengthening the legal institution, right? It's part of the same system, right? So the people who are willing to convict you for crime, these people are also corrupt. So you have to have somebody who is outside the system, then it works better. So that's why I like this very interesting paper. Now it has become quite a bit of old, The Press, Freedom and Corruption by Brunetti and Wieder. So I believe that some of these factors going forward, is going to help, fight corruption more strongly, because the biggest problem with fighting corruption by making laws and all that is that the people who are going to enforce that, these are the same people who are the biggest beneficiaries of corruption, and
Right.
so it's like, you are asking a cat to uh, guard, the vessel of milk, right? So that is the problem. And so that's why if we have some kind of external form of corruption like technology and things like that, that would hopefully make it better.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's very good questions. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Excellent. Any other questions from the audience? If not, perhaps I can go ahead and ask a follow-up question, but also a comment to what Professor Said mentioned. So with respect to the idea of this symmetric, asymmetric, and game, I think there is one component, it's more sociological than economic wise, and that is the trust. So when people actually report,
Mhm.
when if they believe that even if they report, nothing is going to change because there's no trust to bureaucrats, to government entities, to any ministries and the decisions that they or the policies that they implement, I think that takes us to a problem which is going to be much bigger than reporting or paying bribes or so. I don't know if that makes sense. That is totally related to the trust of the society to the government entities and bureaucrats. So
Yes.
if that link is broken between these two, let's say, groups, then I think that corruption is going to be a path dependent according to Douglas North's definition. I don't know if you agree with this and
Oh, no, absolutely. Institutional trust matters, right? So that is one of the chapters by Robert Gilenders and co-author, right? So there is a chapter on that as well, because corruption also, it reduces the trust between different agents, right? Because one of the things about corruption is that it's not enforceable. So many a times a bureaucrat might take a bribe from you and still not provide you the service that they promised, right? Or they might provide you inferior service,
yeah.
and things like that. So yes, it matters.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what about you? Usually there's an ongoing discussion about corruption studies whenever I present, or I presented before in my corruption papers, that okay, you've utilized let's say subjective government indices, all these ICRG, WGI, CPI by international, these are all subjective. Why not creating your own corruption index, for example, by looking at the reports of the journalists and creating government entities within a more of micro level study, like Michael Johnston and Oğuzhan Dinçer has been doing in the US wise, etc. So, what do you think that about that discussion with respect to the relationship between objective and subjective corruption indices?
So so I think one of the things is again technology. So you see now these papers coming out because the technology makes it feasible for you to create those corruptions. So now you can write codes, right? And then it will take the data from different places, right? It was not so much feasible before. Okay. So indeed, that would be a good way to do that, because subjective measures of corruption, although we have seen that it does work quite well, actually. So there is a paper by Nazim Ozan, right? I'm sure you have seen the economic inquiry paper, where he's looking at the ICVS, International Crime Victimization Survey, right, which is the actual crime, and then he correlates with the corruption perception indices, and there's very high correlation.
Yeah.
So evidence does show us that it is pretty good, actually. Nevertheless, yes, it would be good if we can create different kind of corruption indexes that fit in different context, and if we can create those actual measure of corruption, that would be a very, good, significant contribution to the literature. And with the advancement of technology, I think more and more studies are doing that.
Yeah, excellent. I knew already that there's a high positive correlation between the objective and subjective indices, but
Yes.
wanted to open up the discussion for the audience that usually we get these type of questions in our presentations. How are we doing time-wise, Mevza? Should we like continue or like Chandan? Do you have?
I can take a couple of more questions.
It's about you, sir. We have no limit.
Okay. Yeah.
So can I just jump in?
Yeah, please.
Of course, Boris. Go ahead. Yeah.
I just have a particular question, So I'm just wondering if your book, sorry for missing out actually first part of your presentation. So my question is about, if your book adequately addresses, the role of global power structures and international actors in perpetuating corruption, especially in developing countries, because an exploration of how global capitalism and international institutions influence local corruption dynamics, as you know, could enhance the understanding of the issue.
Yeah, no, so that's a very good question. And my answer is in negative. No, my book does not have a chapter like that. And it is actually, I would say this is a very, very important topic. And I wish that I had a chapter in the book on that, but no, I don't. So I guess, someday, well, there is a room for probably Political Economy of Corruption Volume 2, and corruption is such a big topic, right? That no one book can ever capture that. But now that you are mentioning this, I would say that this is probably one of the important omissions from the book. Very, very likely because we could not find at that time a contributor for that specific area.
Thank you. Can I just ask you a second question?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question is that in reviewing the literature, some scholars have addressed the prevailing anti-corruption discourse as being influenced by Western ideologies, which may not be universally applicable. So this perspective, of course, suggests that anti-corruption measures often reflect the interest of donor countries and international organizations, potentially overlooking local contexts and needs. What do you think about this kind of a phenomenon?
No, so based on my knowledge of the literature and the issues, I do have an advantage in that sense, being from India, right, a developing country which is very high level of corruption, and then now living in the United States for over now almost 15 years, right? So you are right, the solutions that we have in the developing, in the Western world that will not really work for the developing part of the world because culture is different, right? The institutional structure is different, but then as unfortunately, that's how it has been because most of the researchers, even when they are doing research on, let's say, developing country, they come from developed parts of the world, right? But I believe that is changing as many of these developing countries are actually investing more and more in education and they are, doing this research at their home. So there is quite a bit of need for that, and I absolutely agree with your observation here. I think we are still not doing enough. We are still not doing enough to address the problems where it actually belongs. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful as these countries are spending, resources, and as the pressure has built on this developed country, so the researchers in these countries are also able to, a bit more closely look at the problems there rather than, being driven by, the interests of, where they are from.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Excellent. Very good. Any other questions?
I can also want to ask a question.
Of course, go ahead, Elifnur.
I have a question about the impact of the international trade of corruption. I mean, if the impact of the corruption on international trade is reflected to the public, the corruption, it affects us economically. Sorry.
I think you got disconnected. Can you please repeat your question?
Okay, sorry. I want to ask the impact of corruption on international trade. If can reflect to the public as a economically side, how we can change the how can I say? Can we achieve a cultural awareness of that? Sorry.
So, as I like to call it, corruption is not something that we can ever eliminate. It is something that we can minimize, because it is inbuilt into the human nature, right? So yes, I do have actually some work on corruption and international trade and FDI. Actually, I have a paper with Fatih, right, on FDI, right? So so the idea is that yes, everybody knows that there is so international trade does create some kind of opportunities for corruption, right? And corruption also hurts international trade. So there is this is one of the situation where you have a bi-directional causality. I don't think that there is much role for the public to play here as such, right? I think it's more about whether businesses, right? They are more strongly looking at that they don't trade more with the corrupt countries, and whether the government can control. But this corruption is not something where I think the public awareness is placed most. I think the public awareness will be probably the best for corruption that is taking place at home, right? So for example, there are certain situations where you do not need to pay the bribe and you will be provided with the service in due time, right? But many a times what bureaucrats do is that they will simply delay the service up to the extent possible, so they create some kind of urgency or some kind of desperation in the public. So if we can create that awareness in the public, I think that will be more useful than creating awareness about the corruption in international trade. That's what I think. But
Okay, thank you.
yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. There is a question in the chat, Chandan.
Mhm.
Let me read it out loud. So, while it might be clear how the political systems in different parts of the world contribute to the spread of corruption, how is the political systems in Europe related to corruption? Is it like finding a crack in the democratic system to pursue corruption, or the democratic system itself facilitate corruption?
So it is a very good question, but it is also a very difficult question to answer. And I really do not have expertise on that. But I believe, and it is again speculative, unfortunately, I do not have a perfect answer to this question. I believe one of the ways it is happening in Europe is because of lobbyism. So there is democracy, but sometimes what happens is that the parties are, two parties are very close to each other, right? And when they want to influence their voting, right? Because at the end, democracy is also about, first objective for most politicians is that am I going to be re-elected or not, right? And that certainly gives some kind, opportunity for them to either close their eyes on something or engage into some kind of lobbying. Um, so that is the best that I can think of. I'm no expert on this, so unfortunately, I cannot really, answer this
So,
the best.
Chandan, who asked the question, I know the person, she's a political scientist, so it's even
Okay.
challenging for me to answer. So,
Okay. So, well,
it's a good question.
I'm
Yeah.
glad that I, accepted that even before knowing that she's a political scientist.
Yeah, I should have told you, perhaps, I don't know, but
No, but this is all right, right? Because it is, political system is very complicated system, right? And so is corruption. So one really has to be an expert on this to answer this really pertinent but complicated question.
definitely. By the way, I'm really curious about like what the Turkish diplomats have been doing outside, considering our score being 34 in the CPI index. According to those diplomats being like more inclined to be more corrupted, I'm really wondering if there's any, perhaps Mevza can do it in the future.
Yeah.
Maybe
They
so.
actually do
Future
have
I will.
some diplomat level data as well. So maybe you can see what is happening from there. So
Definitely, definitely. Very good. Is there any other question from the audience? That's, let's say, our last call.
Yeah, I just
Yeah,
have I
go
have
ahead.
one final question.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you can analyze, perhaps, in the upcoming, just, your publications, if you can analyze, how climate funding mechanisms or ESG frameworks, can be corrupted.
Hmm. Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to explore. Yeah.
Because, some never, kind of but crucial themes like digital governance, climate finance, or intersectional gender analysis are only briefly mentioned or underdeveloped. For instance, another point, perhaps, how technologies like blockchain or AI can both curb and facilitate corruption.
Hmm.
So I'm just wondering if you could also consider, these issues in your upcoming, publications.
Yeah, so I mean, I do have some work on technology. I had like paper on social media, but it's been quite some time now, and I'm sure that there are certain works being done. But as you pointed out, it goes both way, right? Blockchain does, so yeah, so that was actually one of the things about the book, right? That bring in some of these new issues. So yeah, I think now I mean hearing about all these things. Honestly, I'm thinking about maybe there is time in the next few years. There is time for the political economy of corruption volume 2, and given that we have done it once, I think it would be good to follow up. So thank you so much for these comments. I think I'm writing it down, and it's going to be useful.
But of course, how gender interacts with corruption across cultures as well. This is what I suggested actually, my student Mevza, to work on these issues actually, gender aspect of corruption.
So Chandan, Mevza and Barish Alpaslan is just published in Review of Economic Development, right?
Yeah.
sir.
So they have like Professor Barish is a very well-known prominent scholar in the field of economic development. So perhaps we may even do something together in the future. You can keep that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would love that. So, in fact, to give you a little bit comment on that, actually, our GIBO paper actually sort of hints at that, what you are saying, that in different countries, women might play different roles. So we just hint at that. We do not explore it further. So one of the ideas that people argued that women might not be less corrupt, but you see the relationship between women and lower corruption, it is because women have lower, access to networks of corruption, right? So what we show that when we interact that with gender inequality index, we actually find that women have greater impact on corruption in countries where their socioeconomic status is better. So we are again linking that with the fact that, okay, if women's socioeconomic status is better, or in other words, if gender inequality is less, then women as policymakers have greater de facto say, right, in policy making, and that's why that is making a difference. But we do not explore it further, but it is definitely, I think it would be worth to explore that issue further, right, and find more nuances that is hiding in there. Thank you.
Thank you, much appreciated.
Well, I hope that you liked it, the talk, and I definitely enjoyed the conversation, all the questions that we had, so thank you so much.
Very good. Thanks very much, Chandan, for your time. And then I hope we can host you again in the future.
Yeah, I would love to.
Perhaps after initiating the project of the political economy of corruption too.
Corruption too, that's right. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So can I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
So my question will be opposite stream you just mentioned. So I'm thinking about the cultural root of the corruption. Okay, in some culture, I believe in India it's applied as well. In some cultures, the sense of gifts also may lead to high corruption. Maybe recently, because of lack of abstract thinking of the common society. And I believe some people, even they don't know what they do. It's just they accept as a gift, not the act of corruption. What do you think about it? I'm just curious about your ideas.
Yeah. So no. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. No. This is a very important question. But so that is what I was talking about. That's one of the things that makes corruption very difficult to accept. Sorry, very difficult to define. But and I agree with your observation, but I don't think that there is a very large proportion of the bureaucrats that do not really understand the difference between bribe and and not that. So typically, if you receive something that is not very, very high in value, then that is considered that okay, it's a gift. But once if you receive something that is really, really high in value, right, then people do have the understanding. I think this is a tactical understanding between two different, a bureaucrat and the people, right? That okay, hey, I need something from you, and that's why it's the quid pro quo, right? So I think that actually at this point, I think at some point maybe not, but I think at this point the average person in India, right, understands when they are paying bribe versus when they are not. Now the percentage of the population in different countries might definitely be different, right? And it might definitely be higher, as per your observation. It might definitely be higher in countries like India, or more, which we call collectivist countries, right, where gift giving is more common, right? In those countries, the people who are giving gift and not understanding that it might actually be tantamount to bribe, right, is definitely higher than other countries. But I think average person understands the difference between bribe.
My point of view was that they know it's illegal what they do. They're aware of it, but culturally they're
Yes.
not that. Let's say they don't feel bad about it.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Somehow,
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Somehow they say it's okay because I deserve it some way. Because
Yeah.
especially in developing countries, because of the lack of the maybe institutions or the understanding of the laws, it's so normal. Because, for example, you are here, I can give you some money for some reason as a gift, and I believe I can say, okay, you deserve it, okay, in some way, because corruption, I think, or bribery doesn't start with just with high amount. It starts with small gifts, and somehow it becomes like a systematic problem in the like a legal system. I remember once there was a businessman asked me, I want to invest in Turkey. The first question he was asking me how much money I should give bribe to the bureaucrats. So that's why I'm trying to explain in strong culture like India and China as well. There are so gray area of understanding of corruption and the illegal act of illegal. I mean, or as a gift. It is not easy to divide them in two different things. Sometimes it applies each other, or it covers each other. That's why my point of view.
No, indeed, I absolutely agree. There is this problem when it becomes norms, and that's why it becomes very, very important, that you have this cross, within country studies, right, where these people share the same culture, and then you try to find out the factors, right, that might be determining which kind of people are paying bribes and things like that. But yes, that is absolutely correct. Indeed, it is different. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that's about it. I think we can let Chandan go to what was the name of the program?
Dolphy Day. So
Okay.
yeah, because
Okay.
our mascot is dolphin, so Dolphy Day.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
dolphin. Okay. Enjoy your lunch, your coffee, and very good weather outside.
Very good weather outside. Yes, and I'll give you a call tomorrow. Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much for your time again, and I
Yes.
appreciate everyone for their time and an effort to make it tonight. And hope to see you in our Econ Talks number 4 in the future.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was really nice interacting with everybody. Very good questions, very pertinent questions. Gives me some food for thought for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chandan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Nice to meet you, and
Nice
hopefully
meeting you.
to stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Bye-bye. Yeah.
Bye.